all for... Okay, recording in progress. Okay, so good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. We are going to have a very interesting conversation, I'm sure, about the new, the foreign policy that the new US administration is starting to enact in the world. I was going to go for the term Biden doctrine to talk about Biden's foreign policy, but I'm not sure we can talk about a Biden doctrine yet, but I'll talk more about that afterwards. I just want to welcome the two speakers for tonight. We are very, very happy to be joined by Trita Parsi and Gérard Araud. Let me present each of them shortly. So Gérard Araud needs no introduction, but I will do one nonetheless. He is a recently retired diplomat of the highest level. He left diplomatic service with the title of Ambassadeur de France, which is quite something. And his last post was as Ambassador of France to Washington from 2014 to 2019. So he has a lot to tell us about how and why President Trump came into office. At the time, he maintained a very lively Twitter account that he still does maintain to this day. I advise you to go check it out because it's a very good source to know what's important and what's going on in the United States, especially now when we can't travel very easily because Ambassador Araud lives in New York. So that gives him a very good view of what's going on. So we'll listen to him, but after and the other, sorry, I'm losing my French. The other speaker is Mr. Trita Parsi. Good evening, who is an expert on Middle East and especially Iran, the country where he was born not too long ago. You seem young to me. You moved to the United States and you have a PhD from Johns Hopkins that was overseen by Fukuyama and Brzezinski. So that's very impressive as well. And yet now I believe you're a teacher in Georgetown, but that's not your main affiliation. Your main affiliation is as co-founder and executive vice president of the Quincy Institute. And so the Quincy Institute, you will tell us more about it, I hope, is a very recent think tank that has set up business in Washington, DC. And the particularity of the Quincy Institute is that it is, I believe, one of the, maybe the only think tank in Washington, DC that has a very strong anti-interventionist stance, which is not the case with all the other think tanks, I believe. Maybe Cato Institute is also a bit non-interventionist, but I mean, you will tell us more about that. And the creation of that think tank in DC with that anti-interventionist stance is a sign of the times, really, which brings me to say a few words before I leave the floor to the actual speakers, a few words about what I think we are witnessing at the beginning of the new Biden administration, which is a foreign policy setup that is a bit confusing. I do believe that Biden's foreign policy has elements that are actually contradictory, because he comes into power on the wave of the anti-elite sentiment that brought Trump to power 4 years ago. It's that feeling in the country is still there, and therefore Biden says that the United States should refrain from intervening too much abroad and should concentrate on reconstructing the middle class in the United States. So there is a strong current, a strong trend to retract from being active in the world. We see it with the closure of the coalition's presence in Afghanistan that the president has confirmed a few weeks ago. So that's the first trend. But next to that, we have another trend that is a complete contradiction, which is the will that is also clearly stated by President Biden to restore the moral standing of America in the world. Biden is just arrived in London today, and one of the big commitments he's going to make during his week in Europe is going to insist on the importance of democracy, human rights, etc., and the role of America as a beacon of democracy in the world, which doesn't really work with the first trend that I was talking about, which is to go back and concentrate on the US middle class. They also want to appear as a country that will defend democracy everywhere in the world. And a third trend that is also contradictory, and I will stop there because it would be too confusing afterwards. The third trend comes from the left of the Democratic Party. And that we see it expressed by people like Bernie Sanders or even Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. This is the will to also restore America's moral standing in the world, but based on other values, not based so much on democracy and human rights, but based on economic equality and the fight against poverty, which is very important for people like Bernie Sanders. And so you have those different trends, isolationism, political values, economic values that are conflicting and that are expressing themselves differently according to the different hotspots in the world. We see them expressing differently regarding, for instance, the Israel-Palestine crisis, where somebody like Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, will say that the US needs to protect Israel because it's the only democracy in the Middle East. But meanwhile, looking at the same crisis between Israel and Palestine, you can have Bernie Sanders who says the US should protect Palestinians because they are oppressed in a state of apartheid. So you see that the different trends within the Biden foreign policy are conflicting and are give you different results, different objectives according to the crisis you're looking at. So I'm done with my little expose of what we're looking at when we look at Biden's foreign policy. And I will turn to Trita to speak for maybe 10, 12 minutes and tell us what your views are of this foreign policy and maybe address some of the particular crises you are interested in. Maybe mention your institute again. I leave the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a great, great pleasure being with you all. This is actually my first time ever speaking at a conference at Sciences Po, which is a great honor and privilege, and delighted by the opportunity to do so. I'm very grateful for the invitation. It's also a great honor to share the stage with Professor Nardon and Ambassador Araud, who I have admired for a very long time, but also have had my good fair share of Twitter quarrels with. They've always been enjoyable and quite gratifying. I think you laid the stage quite well, that this is a very confusing era, and there's a tremendous amount of contradictions in America's foreign policy right now, and impulses that are going in opposite directions. And as a result, it really is extremely difficult, if not futile, to try to determine what a Biden doctrine is. In fact, I'm not entirely clear that the Biden administration necessarily seeks to have a doctrine per se, and we can get into that a little bit later. But before we continue, let me give you a bit of a background of some of the domestic impulses that have been driving some of the change and that is causing, in some ways, this contradiction that exists, particularly when you take a look at the desired foreign policy of the American elite and the desired foreign policy of the broader American public. Let me throw out some statistics for you. Polls showed just a couple of months ago that more than 74% of the American public support a full military withdrawal from Iraq and 76% from Afghanistan. And that includes a majority of veterans who fought in those wars. You have a situation in which 49% of the American public wants to reduce the Pentagon budget, only 8% seek to increase it. And when it comes to the objectives of American foreign policy, when asked by Pew of what they would identify as priorities, and they were allowed to give several different answers, it's quite fascinating to see what issues were sought as priorities by the public and which ones fell very low on the priority list. The most popular priority was that the United States foreign policy should protect American jobs. Right after, and that was at 75%. At 71%, you had people saying that the United States should focus on pandemics and broader illnesses of that kind, which is quite understandable, mindful of COVID. The question is if this is a temporary phenomenon or if this is actually going to be something that will inform the public's view of security in the longer term. Only 48% believe that it should be a priority for the United States to remain a dominant military force on the global stage. And then when you start scratching the surface on the things that tend to be very popular in Washington, you see how limited their popularity is in the broader public. Defending human rights abroad, only 34%. And perhaps most surprisingly to people in Washington is that promoting democracy ranks only at 20% of the population, believing that that should be a priority of American foreign policy. Now, when you take a look at this over the course of the last 25 years, you actually see that promoting democracy has never been particularly popular with the American public. It's always polled between 21 and 29% from 1993 till 2010, and now we see it's even lower. And the only spike was right after 9/11 at 29%, but it very quickly dropped down again. And perhaps the most, in my view, decisive change in the American public's perspectives on these issues is the very idea that the United States is an exceptional state. When you take a look at older generation of Americans, particularly Republicans, 65 years and older, more than 51% believe that the United States is truly an exceptional state and better than all other countries in the world. When you poll 18 to 29-year-olds, only 15% hold that view. In fact, 36% of 18 to 29-year-olds believe that other countries are better than the US, meaning that more than twice as many 18 to 29-year-olds believe that other countries are better than the United States than believe that the United States is an exceptional state and superior to others. In many ways, this American exceptionalism was a critical, not only, but a critical corner, a building block of the American grand strategy of the 35, 40 last years. And we're seeing how that is withering away amongst the younger population who simply do not share that belief any longer. And that's also reflected when it comes to the idea of the United States retaining global military hegemony. In the older generation, it is extremely strongly held, 68%. But once you go down to the 18 to 29-year-olds, it's only at 50%, and it is continuing to fall down. Reality is that the world, of course, has become multipolar, as my colleague Anatol Yevin wrote in Responsible Statecraft this week. In the 1970s, the G7 countries represented 80% of global GDP. Today, their share is less than 40%. Younger Americans are accepting this and want to adjust US policies accordingly, while the elite and older generation of Americans are both denying and resisting this change. So a critical thing that has happened in the United States that I'm not so sure outside of the US is fully grasped. It's not just that these attitudes have shifted. In some cases, there are long-held views. What's really shifted is that these attitudes are now issues that people vote on. These are not just opinions that people are holding, they're actually voting on these issues and on these opinions. That's a critical shift. That is why the last 5 or so presidents have all campaigned on the idea of ending endless wars, getting out of foreign interventions and focusing more on at home. Once they're in office, of course, the overwhelming consensus of the Washington foreign policy elite descends on them and succumbs them, and as a result, they end up oftentimes pursuing the same policies as their predecessors and contradicting their promises. But they are sufficiently aware of the potency of this outside of Washington, so that every 4 years, these are the type of promises that are being given. We're now starting to see, however, that it's not just rhetoric when it comes to the Biden administration, at least in some limited ways. But the point being that this is the context through which the Biden administration now has come in. They've realized quite well, after 4 years of exile, how angry the public is with the elite, how much of a failure America's foreign policy has been for the American middle class. Part of the reason why, however uncomfortable they are with some of the implications of the views of the American public, they nevertheless are trying to take ownership of this issue and frame their own foreign policy as a foreign policy for the American middle class, because they're quite aware that the American middle class feels essentially abandoned by American foreign policy and the American elite that has been driving. Now, the Biden administration has taken steps, at least in the Middle East, that seems to suggest that, contrary to its predecessors, they're actually starting to do some of these things, such as was mentioned earlier on, the withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan. I can tell you that talking to the Biden administration during the transition, it was quite clear that the very significant withdrawal, I mean, all troops out, was not what they were initially thinking about, but that changed once they came into office and looked at all of their different options. But we're also seeing that they're taking a tougher stance against Saudi Arabia. They made a pledge to end the war in Yemen. They made a pledge to seize the arms sales of offensive weapons to the Saudis. They're also having conversations and dialogue now with the Iraqi government to start ordering some form of American withdrawal from Iraq as well. In some issues, however, we're not seeing a change. The key one, of course, is the one that was mentioned earlier on, is on Israel and Palestine, and it's providing one of the starkest contradictions in American or in the Biden administration's policy towards the Middle East. And this is where you can still see this degree of uncomfort and indecisiveness, because the administration, I believe, is quite torn between the idea that the Abrams Accord is a good thing and that it should be pursued and expanded, primarily because of the benefit it's yielding Israel. But at the same time, that is in contradiction with their desire, which now also to a certain extent has been implemented, to get out of the Middle East, which is manifested right now in the negotiations over the JCPOA. The JCPOA, in many ways, is the exit ticket for the United States from the region militarily, precisely because of the fact that the one issue that could bring the United States back into a full-scale war in the region is the Iranian nuclear program. Putting that program in a box, making sure that the Iranians have no pathway to a nuclear weapon, is an essential step for the United States to start being able to pull out troops, not reduce its diplomatic or economic presence, but not rely its leadership or its diplomacy in the Middle East on its military presence and its military dominance of the region. That contradiction between the Abrams Accord and the JCPOA is going to be played out in Washington over the next couple of months and years. It is a critical sticking point, and I think it brings us to, to square one. What is the Biden administration's doctrine? And I think what we are seeing is that the real challenge for the Biden administration is not the geopolitical complexities of the Middle East. And they're complex, but they're not that complex in comparison to the real challenge they're facing. The real challenge they're facing is the confusion in Washington about what it really wants. That's the problem that the Biden administration is struggling with. It has a population that is pulling in one direction. It has a foreign policy elite that is pulling in the exact opposite direction. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Trita. That was very interesting. Just one quick comment. I can't help wondering whether this generational change in attitudes towards the role of the United States in the world, in the American population, is not linked to the passage of time and the disappearance of the generations that lived throughout the Second World War. Because the role of the United States in the Second World War was so grand and wonderful to the world and to us, for instance, that it, it made it easy to believe that the country had a role in the world. And now that these years and these people are passing away, maybe that's one explanation for the change. But
it is one critical factor, but it's a critical factor that needs to be combined with another. You're talking about a generation that could comfortably and I think genuinely see the United States having played a critical and highly positive role in the Second World War, and in many ways was the key force against Nazism and fascism in the world. So you have a history there of that type of military engagement being seen as the good wars. If you are an American right now that is 20 years old, you cannot point to a single American military engagement that either has been successful or that actually has brought about a better situation. Whether that is Iraq, whether that is Afghanistan, whether that is Libya, or whether it's some of the smaller, or the war on terror as a whole. The war on terror has cost more than $6.4 trillion. And it has actually ended up killing twice as many people between 2001 and 2018 than the terrorists killed during that same period. So given that experience and the combination of the memory of World War II fading out, I don't think it is particularly surprising that the public has shifted in its thinking. What is more surprising is why Washington has not shifted.
But you're there for that. So, okay, thank you. Let us turn to Ambassador Araud for his analysis of what we've seen so far coming from the White House. Thank you.
So thank you, and good afternoon or good evening. It depends on which side of the Atlantic you are. And thank you, Laurence, and thank you, Trita. I think, really there is a sort of a contradiction in the terms when you are talking of Biden doctrine, not only because Biden is an American and Americans don't like doctrine, but also because it's Biden. Biden is the ultimate centrist who has been around forever. In one of my press articles, I've compared him to Jacques Chirac. And nobody would have ever talked about the Chirac doctrine, really is the centrist, which means that when the country is moving, actually is moving with the country, but in a sense remaining in the center as the center of gravity, a center of gravity of, I think, the American policy. That's the first point. The second point is, I think it's very early to speak about the Biden administration's foreign policy. They have been here only for 5 months. And, there is something very weird, I should say, is that when you have a new administration, it takes between 6 months and 1 year before even the people really are appointed at the major roles in the State Department. Really, basically, you have to know, and it's a bit surprising, I'm sure, for Europeans, but that most offices at the State Department are still empty, or basically you have acting people who are doing the daily job, but obviously who are not conducting or formulating a new policy. And so we have to still maybe to wait, and maybe we'll know better after the summer what the American foreign policy will be in the details. The third point is for domestic. Everything is domestic politics. It has always been the case, but it's more than ever because the US is facing, like all Western democracies, by the way, is facing a major domestic, political, economic, I should say, social, cultural policy. And this administration is focused on this crisis. It's not by chance that the National Security Advisor has really been talking about a foreign policy for the middle class. So that's a very important element for the Biden administration is when doing something, deciding something abroad, to think about what are the direct consequences on the domestic scene in political, but also in economic terms. Which, by the way, it's not by chance, for instance, that Joe Biden, one of his first executive orders has to be to reinforce the Buy American Act, which is one of the most protectionist legislation which exists. The third element, which has been emphasized by Trita, is that you have to see Obama, Trump, and Biden in a sense as belonging to their mutual order, I'm sure, but belonging in a sense to the same the political assessment of where the Americans are. And I think Trita has said it in detail. And when traveling for the US, I checked it. There is a fatigue in the American public opinion towards public interventions. Really, the problem that we have, of course, is that we know, we read and we know the people in the Washington bubble, but actually the presidents who have been elected are well aware that for a lot of Americans, really what the absolute priority is domestic, and that the last interventions, American interventions, be in Iraq or be in Afghanistan, have been, I think, a very costly failure. And to summarize it, I think the Americans don't want to be anymore the policeman of the world. And we'll see it, when during this visit of President Biden in Europe, because contrary to Trump, he will reaffirm the commitment of the US to the Article 5 of the NATO treaty. But like Trump, he will maybe not tell the Europeans, but the Europeans will have to understand that in Ukraine, in Syria, in Libya, in the Sahel, that's not an American business. Basically, it's a European business. The American essential interests are not so at stake. So we are going to have an administration which is different in its methods, different in its language, which will be more prone to negotiation within with allies, with partners, and within multilateral organizations. But it doesn't mean basically that the GIs are back. The GIs are not back. I may have, but maybe it's a question of nuances. I may have a bit of difference with Trita on the Middle East, because I do think there is no contradiction in American policy in the Middle East. In a sense, you have the Abraham Accords, which is basically officializing a military alliance against Iran, because the question in the Middle East, and we may disagree on that, but the question of the Middle East, since the Americans have destroyed Iraq, which was the most awful geopolitical blunder in the history of the last 30 years, we need to balance Iran. And whatever is the regime in Tehran, we need to balance Iran, who is now the big boy on the block. And why, by this alliance between Israel, the Saudis, and the Emiratis, the alliance which, by the way, predated the Abraham Accord. They have been sleeping together for the last at least the last decade. It's a way of balancing Iran without really needing an American intervention. And as Trita said and he's perfectly right, the only reason for the Americans to intervene will be the nuclear program. So the JCPOA is indeed the key for the Americans to solve the nuclear issue and to tell the countries in the region, now it's your problem to handle the Iranian ambition. But in a sense, I'm a bit surprised that the word has not been pronounced. I think the American foreign policy could be summarized in 3 words, and for the coming 20 years, with the 3 words being China, China, China. It's very clear what will matter for the, I should say, international relations in the world will be this the relationship between China and the US. And it will be very complicated to manage. First, I should say, for a lot of different reasons. First, there won't be a bamboo curtain because the two countries are so interlinked, and especially economically, that there is no decoupling possible. So you can't simply say them and us. It's not possible. The second point is, of course, that the Asian countries don't want to be called to take side. They don't want to be called to take side. They are worried, of course, about China, but at the same time, including Japan, their relationship with China is quite intense and, in a sense, vital. And the last point, which is maybe more really intellectual, more French, I should say, is that the two countries are not used to realpolitik. Really, basically, China has always been, the empire of the middle, surrounded by tributary princes. And as for the US, it has always needed a cloak of decency upon its foreign policy. It has always denied that it was engaged into a realpolitik. Its geography allowed actually really to deny it. So these two countries have, and in the coming months and years, have to understand the red lines of each one. There will be bumps on the road. There will be misunderstandings, maybe incidents, but of course they are doomed to succeed. And the rest of the world, in a sense, will be really obliged to define its own foreign policy by reference or partial reference to the relationship between the two new superpowers, China and the US. Last point, really, the human rights. Really, I think that's every country, and especially democracies, need a cloak, what I just called the cloak of decency on their foreign policy because of their public opinion. And the US more than other countries, because the US is an ideological country. It has been created not on ethnic basis, not on geographic basis, not even on historical basis, but more or less as an ideological project. And this ideological project can't look at itself in the mirror saying, I'm defending my interest in a selfish way, the way that any country does. So they need the cloak of decency. We also need foreign and Western democracies, but it's particularly important. And on the top of that, it's a democratic administration. So it's obvious that it has to be more vocal about human rights. But, and I think I will conclude on that, to say that there is maybe not a doctrine, but I think there are some instinct in this administration. I've been struck by the fact that all the measures taken on the basis of human rights, and especially sanctions, actually have been extremely limited and have been extremely well targeted, not to undermine the bilateral relationship, be with Russia, with Saudi Arabia, or even with China. I'm convinced, for instance, China, the National Security Council wrote, and actually he was referring at least a few times in this article to Kissinger. And I really do think that this administration instincts and Trita, like myself, we know a lot of these people who are involved into this administration actually have a very strong realist, really understanding of the world. They are not crusaders. Of course, human rights are an important element, and they are really, and they will continue to remind the world public opinion and other countries of the importance of human rights. But they are not going to launch a crusade on behalf of democracy and human rights. And I think that, like, the French will be, and Europeans will be surprised, when if I would say what I'm convinced of, that Obama was a realist and not crusaders. But it's also, I think, the case of these people, most of them having served under Obama. So let's wait. There is a new, I agree with Trita, and there is a new atmospherics in the United States towards a policy of restraint, a policy of relative withdrawal, and for the Europeans, it's quite a challenge. I think Macron was right to talk about strategic autonomy, but unfortunately, but that's another issue. I don't think that the Europeans are ready to hear his wake-up call, and the Europeans are in a denial, and I do believe that they could remain in a denial for some time. Thank you, Laurence.
Thank you, Ambassador. I see that there are no questions yet in the conversation feed, and this is very French. You know, when I was living in DC, my kids would go to school and do a show and tell in the morning every day. And when we came back to Paris, they went to school, the public school down the road. And all of a sudden, children didn't know how to speak up in class. It's not done. And so I have a few things to say, but please ask your questions while I do this. Yes, Ambassador Araud, about your speech, I was reminded that I believe your first post was in Israel as a diplomat many years ago, or maybe not your first posting. Oh, we're losing you. Okay, so the image of has frozen, and well, we'll see what. But my second point was that. So I just wanted to say maybe Peter had some reaction to the ambassador's comment on the ambassador's comments on Israel and Palestine.
Trita, your microphone is off.
Thank you. I thought the ambassador's comments were quite fascinating. I would be amiss if I failed to take up an opportunity to delve deeper into whether the disagreement or nuance. I think it would be worth exploring a little bit further. I think the ambassador's explanation of the Abraham Accord as simply an effort to restore a balance in the region because of the American destruction of Iraq. And as a result, now these other countries have to band together in order to balance Iran. I'm not fully convinced by it for a couple of reasons. First of all, when you take a look at the defense spending, the actual military capabilities of these different countries, the Saudis are outspending Iran with a factor of 5. The combination of the Israelis, the Emiratis, and the Saudis will altogether have outspent Iran with a factor of roughly 9 to 10. They have far superior military technology, certainly the Israelis do, and now with F-35s in the hands of the Emiratis, the Iranian Air Force is not much of a match to that. So I think there's oftentimes a depiction of the power balance that is simply based on geography. And if it was based on geography, what the ambassador was saying, I think would make more sense. But when you go beyond just geography and you look at the capabilities, it does not appear to me that the balance is such that this banding together is needed. But perhaps most importantly, I don't think this really was so much about Iran. I think that has been very much the public notion. I think this, to a much larger extent, was an effort by these different states who all opposed the idea of the United States withdrawing militarily from the region to find new ways of essentially making it more or less impossible for the United States to do so. Even if the US were to reduce its military presence in the region, with the Emiratis now having F-35s, that is the closest you get in having an implicit defense pact with the United States. The Emiratis cannot get an official pact. The US has rejected efforts by that in the past, but by buying these super advanced American airplanes, they know quite well what they're doing. They're creating an incentive, a very strong incentive for the United States to feel compelled to support the Emiratis in any war that they would end up in. Similar to the way that the United States is, up until recently, feeling compelled that it has to support the Saudis in the war against the Houthis, and without the American support, the Saudi war effort would completely fall apart. So the countries that have been opposed to the idea of the US withdrawing militarily, I think, are doing things right now that has a core objective, not the only one, but a core objective of tying the US once more to their security, and by that make sure that a military withdrawal either will become more difficult or nevertheless will not necessarily mean that the United States is completely out of the region militarily. Given that, I do think that there is a contradiction, because what this alliance now, and the ambassador is absolutely right, this is just a formalization of it compared to what already existed. If it means that the Israelis will have access to Saudi or Emirati bases, it would actually dramatically reduce obstacles that the Israelis have faced when it comes to making offensive military action against the Iranian territory. Essentially, it reduces the bar for the Israelis to take military action. If that is the only thing that happens, and it is quite likely going to be destabilizing for the region, the JCPOA has the opposite effect, because here you actually have a diplomatic effort, which of course France was deeply involved in and quite contributed quite extensively to. A continuation of that process instead of building military alliances, I think is a contradiction, not only because the former will try to keep the US stuck in the region, the latter is actually a ticket out of the region for the United States, but also because of what its cornerstones are. Right now, as a result of the United States already signaling that it is leaving the region, contrary to what the Washington establishment said would happen if the US were to do so, we're not seeing more chaos in the region. We're seeing that the Saudis and the Iranians are having their own secret negotiations. The Saudis are talking to Assad, the Emiratis are talking to the Iranians. 6 or 7 meetings have now been held in Iraq between the Saudis, Jordanian, Egyptians, and the Emiratis with the Iranians. We're potentially seeing the beginning of a much deeper diplomatic effort to be able to create stability in the region. That cannot be divorced from realpolitik, obviously, but that's the opposite of what you're seeing with the Abraham Accord, which is two sides building more arms vis-a-vis each other in order to keep each other in check, with essentially zero diplomacy between them.
I may object. I think diplomacy is based on the balance of power. So before negotiating, you should have a balance of power. And there was, as I have said, there was one big power, which was Iran, and fragile countries, really vulnerable countries like the Emiratis, especially considering their geography and their size, and the Saudis. So I think it's very positive that the Israelis, the Saudis, the Emiratis are working together. And also I think it's the Western interest, because we have a strong interest in the stability of these countries. And the French have a military basis in Abu Dhabi. They have an agreement of military cooperation with the Emiratis. And I think it's very positive that the US keep, I should say, a balancing presence in the region. And I think I agree. On one side, the Americans have really understand by the Israelis and the Saudis, Emiratis, that they are not going to do the job for them. But at the same time, the message to the Iranians is, you won't be allowed to move forward. So the two sides are negotiating, and frankly, I think there is a logic behind it. And the logic of our Western interest, and the logic also of keeping the balance, the military balance. There is no negotiation without a military balance, and we have this military balance. And we have also another element, which with the Saudis, with particularly MBS, the fact was that Trump had given a carte blanche to MBS, which has led to a lot of very unsuccessful and unfortunate initiatives. And I think that the message sent by the Biden administration was perfectly focused, really basically saying you are the Saudis, you are important for us, but at the same time, you have made mistakes, so you are pushed back into the antechamber. So MBS is not able to have access to the president, but only to the Secretary of Defense. So I think it was a very good message, and again, a very realistic message. I'm sure that in the White House there is no lost love for MBS, but they have been able really basically to find the right balance.
Thank you. The discussion should not. I don't know if we should go on focusing on the Middle East, or if we.
No questions. So let's go beyond that.
You've both had your say, right? So let's move on to other issues, if you agree. Ambassador, we had lost you earlier, but I had a question on your speech. There seemed to be, and this is the thing that is great when you can ask people questions right after they've spoken. There seemed to be, I was taking notes when you spoke, and there seemed to be a little contradiction, because you said the US are not used to realpolitik. They want to cloak a cloak of decency over their action. And then afterwards you said, at the same time, the present administration is going to be realist and not focus on human rights so much. So
no, exactly. They know, basically, the Americans, of course, have conducted a realpolitik foreign policy because there is no other choice. But they have always needed what I call the cloak of decency. They've always needed, this sort of rhetoric, lofty rhetoric about what they are doing. And versus China, it's difficult because you have two systems which are quite different, and so it means that the Crusaders, I should say, logic of vision is very difficult to dismiss, and especially when the Chinese are behaving the way they are behaving with the Uyghur in Hong Kong, really, so, and elsewhere. So it makes the life of any American administration quite difficult. But never, you have the difference between really about Brzezinski, one of the teachers of Trita, and I've known him very well also, and Henry Kissinger on the other side. Really, when you have an order, world order, you may want to change it, or you may want to try to really stabilize it. And I think we are more in a stabilizing moment than changing. And I do think, again, that this administration, while taking into account, it's obliged to take into account the course of the public opinion, I think this administration, nevertheless, is more, at its core, is more realist. So we saw it in Anchorage in Alaska, when there was the first meeting between Americans and the Chinese at a high level. There was publicly, there was a lot of rhetoric, fierce rhetoric on both ways. Really, but at the same time, they spent 8 hours behind closed doors. So I don't think that during these 8 hours, they have talked about human rights. So that's what we need. But again, it will be complicated, and we are the United States. It's a democracy. And there are really strong feeling, and it's also a country, there is a sort of Manichaeism in the American mindset. Americans want to have, really an enemy, identified enemy. There is the weight of the Cold War behind it. So there is also this psychological and political elements, which, on the top of being a very complicated relationship, will make the balance that they have to find, I should say, complicated. That's the reason I was referring to bumps on the road. There will be mistakes on misunderstanding on both sides.
Okay, so let's stay on China for a little while. I have a question for both of you. Trita, if you think the US should refrain from military action in the world, then what happens? It's a very blunt question. What happens if China escalates to the point of military intervention in, say, Taiwan, for instance? And afterwards, I will ask Ambassador Araud what he thinks Europe can do, should do, when confronted with US's wishes for an alignment with them against China. So Trita, you're first.
Thank you so much. Let me first clarify, and perhaps I can take a moment to say a couple of words about the Quincy Institute. Quincy Institute is not a pacifist organization, so we're not saying that the United States should not be able to defend itself, or that it should not have a military capability, or that interventions per se are problematic. I think there can be cases in which those would be necessary. However, and I've seen it also in some of the questions in the chat, there's a confusion here in which I think people are thinking that the US not engaging militarily in the manner that it has in the last 30 years means that it is withdrawing from the world and that it's ceasing its engagement. I think that actually reflects how corrupted our perception and understanding of engagement has become, in which we think that if the United States is not bombing other countries, it has ceased engagement. That is not the case. Engagement ends essentially through these type of unnecessary military actions. We favor a very strong diplomatic role for the United States as well as trade. We just do not believe that it is necessary nor helpful for the United States to take on the role, as Ambassador pointed out earlier on, the policeman of the world, or essentially meaning that in specific areas of the world, or not all actually, that the United States needs to be in a dominant military position. Because in many of those cases, we actually seen that being destabilizing rather than stabilizing. And perhaps most importantly, from an American perspective, it has actually not made America more safe. It has made America less safe. And it's been extremely costly. Again, part of the reason why the population is turning away from us. So in the case of China, the issue is not that the United States should not be able to defend itself, or if it has treaty obligations, walk away from those without any renegotiation. But I think the broader issue with China is that we are seeing, and an ambassador would be able to testify to this as well, even though I think he's quite correct that behind the scenes, clearly things are taking place in which the administration is pursuing things in a realist manner. But the rhetorical atmosphere in Washington right now, as well as the push of some powerful forces to try to get us into essentially a Cold War with the Chinese. If a Cold War with the Chinese becomes the organizing principle of American foreign policy, then almost all other things that the American public wants to see changed with American foreign policy will not come about. First of all, you're going to see an increase of the Pentagon budget at a time when the money needs to be used much more intelligently here at home for a whole set of different priorities. You will see, rather than starting to view regions such as the Middle East as less strategically important, which is increasingly common here in Washington, people are recognizing the Middle East is not as strategically important to the United States as it was 30, 40 years ago for a whole set of issues, including shale oil. That will likely also change, because suddenly the entire globe will become the arena of competition between the United States and China. And then if the US is not dominating the Middle East militarily, then the argument will be, well, then the Chinese are going to move in and do that, which I don't believe they would, but nevertheless, that would be the argument. So I think it's essential to avoid that type of a scenario that actually reduces America's options in a very, very sensitive and important relationship. And on top of that, perhaps most important, we are now living in a century in which, for the first time in human history, we can honestly say that the greatest threat to us is not the threat of another nation state. It is the threat of either pandemics or other common challenges such as climate chaos. To be able to address this, and here I'm sure Ambassador Araud will find me to be quite sinful, but we may need to transcend some of the original ideas of realism, because we are going to need an unprecedented level of human collaboration to be able to address this, rather than moving into a Cold War in which we will not be able to have any movement on this. And let me just make one last point. We have now more than 630 or 650,000 American deaths in COVID. More than all of the wars that the United States has been engaged in since World War II. None of the $800 billion to the Pentagon did anything to be able to protect the American people from this absolute disaster. And I'm sure it's similar situations in the rest of the world. Our very conception of security, particularly if we want to talk about security for the middle class, which then brings security not just to the borders of the country, but to the individuals living inside of those countries, needs to start changing. And if we move into an unnecessary Cold War with the Chinese, we will not be able to adjust to this new reality.
No, I want to really to say that I agree 200% with what Rita said. I'm convinced on 2 points. The first point is, you know, the military force. I think the West, of course, the US, but also the French, actually, we have certainly overused military force in the last decades. You know, right now, the President Macron, you know, is announcing apparently that there will be some withdrawal, French withdrawal from the Sahel. And I think it's a necessary and courageous decision. You know, when you have a big hammer, every problem lies like a nail. And really, basically, the US, at some moment, the US was spending 50% of the world military expenditure, and now they are around 30%. So that's really, and what is the result? You know, I think, unfortunately, after 20 years, we can look at the result, and I don't see one use of the military force which has led to a positive political result. So diplomacy has to be back, and Trita is right. The fact that the GIs are going back home doesn't mean that the US is going back home. We need US diplomats. We need a US diplomacy. Frankly, under Trump, US diplomacy had vanished, had disappeared. So we need a re-engagement, but a political re-engagement on the of negotiation. The second element, which is a very, very important element, and maybe paradoxical for some or for the audience, is that the problem that the humankind is facing is, in a sense, not really the geopolitical problems. Of course, you know, what is happening in Armenia is important in the Eastern Mediterranean, but the future of the humankind, you know, basically is engaged about global issues where we need to work together, all together. You know, we were talking about, of course, the climate change, but there is not only the climate change. We are living an incredible technological transition that we have to manage. Artificial intelligence, what does it mean? The governance of internet, you know, really the surveillance technologies, the cryptocurrencies. We have a lot of major issues that we have to solve together. Yes, you have Russians and Chinese hacking in the US, but when I was Undersecretary for Political Affairs, I went to Beijing and Moscow, and they were telling me that, of course, they were also victims of hacking. You know, really, so what is, I think, very important for the future is to do what we the French, we did for COP21 about climate change, is to convince, really to have all the stakeholders and to convince them that we have a common interest as a humankind. You know, and I think that more than ever, there are humankind common interest. So I really do agree very, very enthusiastically with what Trita said.
Okay, thank you. And so, Ambassador, what do you think should be Europe's response to Americans' demands or wishes regarding their so-called Cold War, at least rhetorical Cold War in DC against China?
Well, first, I think, well, I should say that my very quick answer will be that we are, of course, much closer to the US than we are to the Chinese, but at the same time, we shouldn't be aligned to the US because our interests are different. We are not threatened militarily by the Chinese, and there is no ideological threat by the Chinese. There is no Chinese Communist Party in Europe. So it's really, so we should, the first thing that we should do is to define our interest. And again, here we are bumping into the European weaknesses, which is the division of the Europeans, really. And the question mark is whether the Europeans will be able to define, a sort of either a common policy towards China. We need to have our own policy based on our own assessment of our own interest. But again, we are closer to the US, and especially closer to the US in terms of, I should say, international law, international regulations, international organizations. Really, that's, for instance, in the framework of the World Trade Organization. It's obvious that the Chinese are cheating. Really, that's obvious, and they are not respecting basic rules of international trade. But I think the best way is to try the European Union and the Americans to work through the World Trade Organization, or maybe to coordinate their position. So it's really, so we can work together on that without being led, becoming, in a sense, the small soldiers of the Americans. But I'm not even sure that, it's the visit of Joe Biden right now would be interesting also, as I said, on the question mode from the Europeans, what the Americans want. I'm not sure that the Americans are going to rally us. And I'm not sure that this administration is looking for a Cold War. Again, there is a difference between what Twitter said, which is true, the rhetoric, but the rhetoric, because it's a democratic government, and you have all this public opinion, and really China is the bad guy, which is undeniable considering their behavior, their human rights behavior. So but I'm not sure they are into the idea of a Cold War. If I may, I'm going back to the Taiwan question. First, I don't see why China would attack Taiwan, which would be a sort of a world disaster. The collapse of its economy. I think a lot of people don't realize how weak the weaknesses of China. It's really, we are describing it as a sort of a monster.
Laurence, do you want me to jump in?
Sorry.
No, go on, please. Go
okay,
on.
I think China has no interest to invading Taiwan, but China has a very clear red line. It's interesting, this question, because, for instance, nobody has noticed that for the first time the U.S. administration has sent a secretary to the island of Taiwan under Trump. You can say why not? But for the Chinese, it's really we are looking at each gesture of the Americans. For instance, the Biden administration, I don't know why, they have invited the representative of Taiwan to the inauguration, which is the first time it was done for the last 30 years. And immediately, of course, the Chinese, you can say they are paranoid, but that's the way we should know that there is a sort of two-way street. There are an absolute red line, which is the independence of Taiwan. That's the line. If we are moving towards this independence, we have to wait a reaction of China. You can consider it's not normal, it's bad, why, but that's a fact. And when you are defining a policy, you have to take into account. So I really don't see any reason but a démarche by the Americans towards Taiwan, but in political terms, why the Chinese would attack Taiwan.
Okay. I think it's very unfair that I haven't really paid attention to the question. Hasn't been mentioned. Is it not anymore a concern for the US? Well, the quick answer would be no, it's not, but I know that it's wrong. It is a concern. So maybe, Ambassador, you want to comment on that?
Who is the concern? What is the concern?
Russia.
Oh,
we haven't spoken
Russia, don't forget,
word about Russia.
Oh, don't forget what Obama was saying, that Russia is waging 19th century war with 20th century weapons in the 21st century. The American and what Obama said also, that Russia is a regional power. So I think for this administration, and considering the stupidity of the Russians when trying to interfere with the American elections, which really, frankly, was stupid, this behavior of a colonel of a KGB, considering that, and considering also, I don't think there is a high expectation from the American side towards Russia. We are not in the reset mode of 2009. But really, I guess that Joe Biden wants to have a tete-a-tete with Putin to tell him, you know, really, basically what is the American vision, saying we are not threatening Russia. But frankly, if you go on, our bilateral relationship, of course, will suffer. Really, in a sense, setting the terms of the relationship, but it won't be a central relationship to the great suffering of the Chinese, the Russians, to the great pain of the Russians. It won't be a very, but at the same time, you have to take into account Russia, which is a pain. It's not a global threat. It's not a global power, but in a lot of different places, Russia is a pain. For the French, for instance, in Africa, what the Russian mercenaries are doing in Central African Republic is amazing. Really, it's beyond any anything that we have ever seen. You know, you have white mercenaries who are making the conquest of an African country. We have not seen that since the 1890s, I suppose. So that's more or less, I suppose, what this administration wants to do, setting the terms, telling there is no hostility, inner hostility of the administration towards Russia, but at the same time saying we have red lines, and these red lines, we are warning you that we will react if you are going to act. But again, with all the past, all these assassinations in Europe, this interference into elections, and what the Russians are doing in eastern Ukraine and in Syria, I'm not sure that anything possible, anything positive or is really possible. Macron has tried, and it has led to nothing.
Laurence, could I say a couple of words
Sure,
about China?
please.
And I agree 100% with Ambassador that I do not believe that, I've never come across anyone in the administration who explicitly would say that they would like to see a Cold War. And in fact, in some of the documents that they're producing right now, they're carefully not using that terminology. The problem, though, is that unless one is careful about the atmospherics that is created, one may very well end up having one's back against the wall and essentially be locked in a position that one never desired in the first place. We just had Congress pass the Strategic Competition Act and other measures that are taking place in Washington that can lead to a scenario in which, even if the desire is not to go in that direction, both because of the limitation that it puts on the US's option, but also because of the reactions that it will generate from the Chinese, will bring us to a situation in which, whether we like it or not, we will be in some form of a de facto Cold War. And I've seen this happen in this city several times now. It is extremely easy to create enmities in the city. It is extremely difficult to start peeling away those enmities and moving in a positive direction. I was in the middle of the JCPOA fight in 2015, and it was stunning to see the tremendous vested interest that existed in order to sustain a status quo with Iran, even if that status quo, or perhaps precisely because that status quo eventually will lead towards a military confrontation. Now, Iran is one thing, China is a completely different thing. To end up in that type of a scenario with a country like Chinese is going to be absolutely devastating, not just for the Chinese, for the United States, and for the world as a whole. So I think the stakes are much higher, and lack of carefulness here can lead to scenarios that no one actually desires.
So what you're saying is that the United States should show more restraint in the expression of the aggressivity towards China. Otherwise,
I think in general, the United States should show more restraint. I mean, that is the philosophy of the Quincy Institute. And by the way, just as a parenthesis, we're named the Quincy Institute after John Quincy Adams, who almost exactly 200 years ago, 1821, July 4th, gave a very famous speech in which he said, the United States goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. If she does, he continued, it may very well become the dictresses of the world, but it will come at the expense of her own spirit and her own liberty. which is, I think, exactly what we've seen in the last 20 years, as the United States has become more and more involved in foreign wars that have no particular purpose and certainly no particular end state or goal. We have seen the erosion of civil liberties and freedoms inside the country itself. So in general, yes, showing more restraint, but the ability to show restraint actually husbands your resources so that when you do need to act firmly, you will be able to do so with credibility. Whereas I think there's been so many false promises of what the United States will protect, what the United States will do, that the credibility of both American promises and American threats have been eroded because the US has simply become way too overextended.
We're reaching the conclusion of our session, but let me stay on Quincy for a minute, because you're presenting your institute to a European audience today. I would have two questions. First of all, I believe that the funding of the institute is very surprising in the American context. So if you could tell us about that. And then my second question will be a bit more difficult. What's your traction within the Biden administration? I would believe that what they call the blob, which is the traditional DC diplomatic corps that is very pro-intervention generally, doesn't listen to you very much. Am I right?
Let me start off with the first question. Yes, I think part of the reason why Quincy got a tremendous amount of attention is because we managed to get George Soros on the left and Charles Koch on the right to come in jointly to help fund the Quincy Institute. They are not in any way, shape, or form our only funders. I think altogether they probably provide, at this point, 25% of our funding total. I mean, we have plenty of other funders. But it was a very interesting new development in Washington, because obviously on all other issues, they're very, very far away from each other, although they have collaborated on criminal justice reform. And they have collaborated on some foreign policy issues before, but this was the first time they came in jointly together to help fund a new institute. And I think it sent a signal very clearly to the rest of Washington that the discontent with the status quo foreign policy has grown so big, and that the similarity that exists both on the left and on the right in their critique of the policies of the center have now grown so strong that collaboration that in the past was more or less unthinkable was now becoming a reality. And I think, and this is a very deliberate strategy from our end, in order to be able to really do an almost paradigmatic shift of American foreign policy. That cannot be done with only one party in the United States. It needs to have support on both sides of the aisle. And that is the fascinating thing, that when it comes to the critique against this interventionist, over-militarized foreign policy, it is very, very common on the right. We saw that with the way Trump talked about it. It is also obviously very, very common on the left. But it's not until now or more recently that there's been institutional collaboration between the two sides for this objective. As to your second question, I would say that actually on some of the issues, without going into too much detail, but I can say on Afghanistan, for instance, we have worked quite closely with the administration, precisely because we strongly favor an American withdrawal from Afghanistan. It is the longest running war in American history, and that needed to come to an end. And on other issues as well, I would say on the JCPOA, for instance. But then there are other issues on China, for instance, that we may have some more differences, but we have a very good working relationship as well with the Biden administration, as well as key elements in Congress. And when it comes to the rest of the bloc, we work where we can with those who are open, but our ultimate objective is to inject some new ideas and new thinking and challenge the status quo. And there's obviously going to be some who are going to be uncomfortable with that type of a disruptive effort as we are pursuing. But I would say that more than anything else, the fact that there's been so many articles written by people in the foreign policy establishment about Quincy, I think it's a clear signal that they recognize that what we represent is a very potent element of the American public, and they have to start listening, and they in many ways are. So it's not a transitionary, it's not a temporary phenomenon. I think it is a new reality in Washington, and the wise ones in Washington are adjusting to that.
Well, that's quite a declaration. Thank you very much. I think we understand a bit more what you're about. I think we're going to draw to a close, but I will leave the last word to Ambassador Araud. If you want to comment on the Quincy Institute or give us any other.
No, I think it's what is striking when you are an ambassador in Washington, D.C. is actually I should say, the conformism, or I don't know if you can use the word in English. It's very clear, really, when you go into the big think tanks that everybody knows, everybody is more or less thinking alike. And even actually the foreign scholars who are attracting to this think tank very quickly are joining the same bubble. It's striking that actually two presidents as different as Obama and Trump have used a nickname for it. It was the blob for one and the swamp for the other. So again, these people are quite talented. They know a lot of things, but there is, I think, a group thinking which is very, very, very pregnant in Washington, D.C. So it's very good to have a new voice, really to create a real debate, because we were missing this debate. When arriving, and I will conclude on that, I was extremely struck that nobody was scared about what happened in 2003 and the invasion of Iraq, which was a total disaster, a humanitarian, political, geopolitical disaster, really. And basically, you had the same people who had been advocating for the war were still around, and actually very often advocating actually for a new war against Iran. So, and there was no, I think, soul searching. There was really not a sort of exercise saying, why were we wrong? I've just finishing writing a book, and a part of the book is about the Vietnam War. And after the Vietnam War, there was some soul searching. People were looking at their assumptions, which had led to the Vietnam War, and saying, but why? What was the mistake? And I think that there should have been a soul searching in Washington, saying why? And why Iraq? Why Afghanistan, which are two major failures? And in a sense, the creation of Quincy is palliating this lack of debate and this lack of soul searching in our foreign policy elites. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I think we will stop there. Thank you, Trita. Thank you, Gérard. This was very interesting. I do believe this conference will be online. That's what Sciences Po told us when we started. So
yes.
Excellent. Okay, so thank you, everyone, and good evening, good afternoon.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you all so much. Appreciate it. Thank you.